He got past the German defenses already. How? He just drove right around them. Yeah, I guess, sometimes you just gotta put your foot down and go for it. Well, I know who I'm gonna call if I ever have a T-34 drag race. Huh? Yeah, that does sound really cool. Yeah. Early hours of July 12th, 1943. Everything comes down to this. All the hours of training, all the fighting, the rush of deployment. It's the moment everyone has been waiting for. This morning, the Battle of Prokhorovka begins. I'm Indy Neidell. This is a World War II in real-time miniseries on the Battle of Prokhorovka. Last time, we looked at the deployment of forces by Paul Hausser's 2nd German SS Panzer Corps and Pavel Rotmistrov's Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army. We also saw, as Rotmistrov made his final preparations for his counterattack, that much of his reserve force was diverted. Whatever last-minute hiccups there are, there's no turning back now. The morning of July 12th dawns warm, humid, and cloudy. At about 6 a.m., Rotmistrov joins his 29th Tank Corps commander Ivan Kirichenko at the Corps Forward Command Post on a hillock west of Prokhorovka. From here, he has a good view of the undulating fields where Kirichenko's and Bakharov's tank forces will soon advance. As Rotmistrov prepares to order his army forward, though, aerial combat begins, and German and Soviet fighters are soon entangled in swirling dogfights while bombers and dive bombers from both sides attack their targets. At about 8:15, the Soviet artillery roars into action. The big guns go up first, followed by the screaming Katyushas hurling forth glowing sheets of rocket fire. The aim of this barrage is to disrupt German command and control, to smash the enemy's fortifications, and to suppress their anti-tank guns. The Red Army itself will later admit that the barrage was pretty ineffective, in part because of poor intelligence work. Not only that, but some of the artillery is controlled by Nikolai Vatutin's Voronezh Front Command, and some by Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, and the two commands don't work together well when planning the barrage. As the after-action report of 5th Guards Tank Army puts it, the effectiveness of the fire was low. There was a lot of firing, but it was uncoordinated. At 8:30, the Katyushas of the 76th Guards Mortar Regiment fire their final volley. Rotmistrov and his officers watch as the final dust clouds spray into the air from the impacts. There's a few seconds of silence until Rotmistrov's radio man gives the command, "Stall! Stall! Stall!" With these shouts of "Steel! Steel! Steel!" The silence gives way to the powerful rumble of engines, the squeak and clank of steel tracks, and the shouts of young men. Rotmistrov's tanks begin rolling forward, with scores of riflemen clinging to their metal shells. For Rotmistrov, this is the culmination of months of work, of training, equipping, and organizing his army. Later in life, he will recall the moment. Immediately, there followed the signals to attack from the commanders of the Tank Corps, the brigades, the battalions, the companies, and the platoons. I look through my binoculars and watch as our glorious 34s move out from under their cover and, accelerating, rush ahead. Unfortunately for us, Rotmistrov's memories then take a turn into, fantasy. See, he claims that his tanks basically run into the advancing German panzers who are simultaneously attacking towards Prokhorovka. Within minutes, he says, his 29th and 18th Tank Corps have sliced head-on into the combat formations of the German fascist forces. This is a pretty common image of Prokhorovka even to this day, but it is really an invention of Rotmistrov and Soviet propaganda. The head-to-head combat in open fields, the swirling tank fights, and the T-34's ramming tigers are all a bit of a myth. Rotmistrov's tanks actually first run into fierce anti-tank fire from the Panzer Grenadiers at Oktyabrski State Farm and Hill 252.2, supported by panzers. It is the 32nd Tank Brigade, led by Colonel A.A. Liniev, that attacks the German positions on the hill, along with their attached paratroopers and with the support of the 1529th Heavy Self-Propelled Regiment and 3 batteries of the 1446 Self-Propelled Regiment. Liniev's tanks in the first minutes of the attack were greeted by a hurricane of anti-tank fire. Quickly, more than 20 tanks, almost one-third of the brigade's complement, blazed up like torches or began to emit thick plumes of dark smoke. The brigade's combat formation was shattered, and the surviving tanks began to maneuver on the battlefield and to crawl away in different directions, trying to use any folds in the terrain in order to escape the ruinous fire. However, the sector was narrow, and approximately 100 armored vehicles had crowded into it. The advance of the 32nd Tank Brigade is hampered because their supporting unit, the 31st, is slow to arrive in position. But the vehicles do manage to start making it onto the crest of Hill 252.2. There, they encounter the 3rd Battalion of SS Panzergrenadier Regiment 2, who are dug into trenches and foxholes surrounded by their half-track armored personnel carriers. This battalion is led by Joachim Peiper, who will become infamous about a year and a half from now for a massacre of American troops at Malmedy in the Battle of the Bulge. Peiper and his men have been hearing rumbling tank engines for quite a while now, and they're pretty sure something is coming their way. But Robert Forchik writes, they only spot the Soviet tanks when they're about 1,000 meters away as the vehicles emerge from the morning haze and the smoke from the artillery fire. Peiper's men set off purple smoke to alert their regiment to the approaching tanks. First to respond to the smoke signal is the leader of the 6th Panzer Company, none other than Rudolf von Ribbentrop, son of the German foreign minister. Rudolf joined the Waffen SS back in 1939. Ribbentrop's company is down to just 7 Panzer IVs, well below its paper strength of 22 tanks because of combat losses and mechanical failures suffered since July 5th. Ribbentrop forms his 7 tanks into a line formation, and they advance up the reverse slope of Hill 252.2, and then pass through the positions of Peiper's Panzer Grenadiers in order to get to the forward slope of the hill and open fire on the Soviet tanks. He and his company engage and destroy a few of them, but are dumbstruck by the sheer number of enemy vehicles approaching. While we were driving down the forward slope, we recognized some T-34s, which were about 800 meters from us and trying to outflank us. We immediately stopped on the forward slope and opened fire. We succeeded in knocking out some Russian tanks which started burning. 800 meters was an ideal shot for a good gunner. We were waiting for some more tanks to appear down there while I habitually looked around, and in the real sense of the word, it took my breath away, because at about 150 to 200 meters in front of us, out of this soft hollow appeared 15, 20, 30, 40, and then a no longer countable number of Russian T-34s with mounted infantry which at full speed were storming towards us. Ribbentrop loses 4 of his company's vehicles in the fighting, and the sheer weight of the Soviet tanks is far too much to hold back. Kirichenko's tanks are moving incredibly quickly, still firing on the move, and they simply rush past Ribbentrop and his men. By now, Peiper and his Panzer Grenadiers are fighting for their lives against the Soviet assault. They had not expected to go into battle until later in the day, and according to one German lieutenant's recollections, at least some of the men are still asleep when the Soviets launched their attack. We were all fast asleep when they were suddenly all over us with aircraft and an endless mass of tanks with infantry riding on them. It was hell. They were around us, over us, and among us. The Panzer Grenadiers have their anti-tank guns with them, but a lot of it really is pretty much hand-to-hand fighting. The Germans leap out of trenches to lob grenades at advancing tanks, exchange bursts of submachine gun fire with enemy paratroopers, and even ambush T-34s by attaching magnetic anti-tank mines to the hulls. All the while, they call in support from artillery and Stukas. Here's how a Red Army lieutenant in the 9th Guards Airborne Division will later recall this close-quarters fighting in the vicinity of Hill 252.2. Moving on, we ran up to another trench. I hopped into it and almost collided with a German. His hands were upraised. I was stunned by the surprise and lost my head because this was the first living German soldier I'd ever seen. One of the men from my platoon, who leaped into the trench right behind me, shouted, "Lieutenant, shoot him! What are you looking at?" At that moment, a burning tank nearby suddenly exploded. The German flinched and turned his head, and in my fright, I squeezed my trigger and fired a long burst into the back of his head. There are actually 2 slightly different interpretations of the opening hour or so of the battle. The one I've just described comes up in work by Ben Wheatley, Robert Forczyk, and Karl-Heinz Freiser, who edited the German Bundeswehr's history of the war. They all focus heavily on Joachim Peiper's 3rd Battalion being the first troops to be hit by the Soviet attack while they were still entrenched on Hill 252.2. But David Glantz and Jonathan Haus frame things slightly differently. They say that the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment as a whole had actually begun advancing in a line from Oktyabrski State Farm, Hill 252.2, across to the railway line, and that they basically walked into the advancing tanks of the 18th and 29th Tank Corps. They don't mention Peiper or his 3rd Battalion by name at all. So, 2 different accounts of the start of the battle. Who's right? Well, Glantz and Haus were writing back in the late 1990s, so perhaps some new information has come to light since then. Maybe some of the Panzer Grenadiers had begun to inch forward, and most people just don't bother to mention it because it's not important to the overall picture. Or perhaps this is simply a case of historians focusing on different elements which happened very close together and within minutes of each other during a chaotic battle. James Newman, our staff historian who wrote this series, says, "On balance, I think the Peiper angle is probably correct, especially as Glantz doesn't explain how the advancing Panzer Grenadiers managed to survive the onslaught of rushing tanks while advancing across open ground." This is one of the challenges when focusing on a battle like this. There will always be differences in the key accounts, and it is impossible to recreate a perfect or completely accurate story. Sometimes there are big differences that change the meaning of the event. Other times it's smaller things like this, details that don't change the outcome or the course of the battle. But they are interesting historical tidbits, and part of the joy of being a historian is weighing these accounts. There are plenty more such disagreements throughout the battle, as we shall see. The 29th Tank Corps is also attacking south of the railway line, where the 25th Tank Brigade is hitting the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of Leibstandartes 1st Panzer Grenadier Regiment. The 25th has 31 T-34s and 36 T-70s. They also have the support of the 1446 Self-Propelled Gun Regiment and the weakened 169th Tank Brigade from Popov's 2nd Tank Corps, which has 14 T-34s and 4 T-70s. They have the paratroopers of the 28th Guards Airborne Regiment and the riflemen of the 58th Motor Rifle Brigade with them. The vehicles of the 25th Tank Brigade advance parallel to the railway line, heading towards Stalinsk State Farm through a gap in the woods. But as they are crossing the open ground, they are ambushed by flanking fire from 5 Marder 3 tank destroyers located within the farm. The Marder 3 is an open-top tank destroyer based on the Panzer 38T chassis, which mounts a 75mm high-velocity anti-tank gun. The Panzer Grenadiers also use their 75mm PaK-40 AT guns in devastating frontal fire against the Soviet tanks. The fighting will rage on here for several hours with attack and counterattack, but the Germans will hold back the Soviets, inflicting devastating losses on the 25th Tank Brigade. Also in the 29th Tank Corps sector, parts of the 2nd Echelon 31st Tank Brigade have now entered the fray. While the 2nd Battalion joins the fighting on Hill 252.2, the 1st Battalion has gone on something of an infiltration mission. Battalion Commander Major Ivanov has led his force of about 15 T-34s south of the railway tracks and has bypassed the German defenses. Concealed by the woods, he's dashed along the railway line at full speed, avoiding more German anti-tank guns on Hill 242.5 and the Leibstandarte Division's artillery on Hill 241.6. By doing this, he's managed to break into the southern outskirts of Komsomolets State Farm, a full 5 kilometers behind the front line. Behind him follow the men of the 53rd Motorized Rifle Brigade. From there, they are well placed to threaten the German command posts, communications, and artillery positions. The fighting still rages on top of Hill 252.2, where Peiper and his men lose about 20 of their half-tracks, and Ribbentrop lost 4 of his 7 panzers. Kirichenko loses a lot of tanks too, But the Soviet storm is so powerful, it pretty much just blasts straight through Piper and Ribbentrop. By about 10 a.m., Kirichenko's tanks are charging down the reverse slope of the hill towards the two panzer companies at the bottom, which are positioned behind the anti-tank ditch they overcame in yesterday's fighting. This dash down the hill is all part of a plan. See, the Soviet commanders have greatly overestimated the number of Tiger tanks the Germans possess, and they want to eliminate the Big Cat's superiority at longer range by closing the distance as quickly as possible. In reality, there are no Tigers waiting for them here. The two tank companies are fielding the extra armored model of the Panzer IV with their Schütz and side skirts and long-barreled 75mm high-velocity guns. These are very capable tanks, and are superior to the T-34 in many ways in their own right. The extra armor and the long gun also make them look like a Tiger from a distance. And this is part of the reason for the overestimation of Tiger numbers on the Eastern Front. The same will be the case next year on the Western Front. Still, whatever flawed logic behind the tank charge, the danger is still very real for the Leibstandarte. Two panzer companies, even with support from artillery, air power, and anti-tank guns, do not have great odds against the huge number of tanks heading for them. As for Rotmistrov's right flank, the 18th Tank Corps has the 170th Tank Brigade advancing on the Corps' left and the 181st advancing on the right, just south of the river Psel. Things are tough for them too. In part, this is down to some basic facts of geography. The terrain in 18th Tank Corps sector was cut by 3 deep ravines extending from the left, southern bank of the Psel River towards the rail line. Because of this, the brigades of the first echelon were compelled to concentrate their armor on the Corps' left flank, in front of the strongly fortified anti-tank defenses on the Oktyabrski State Farm. The tanks of the 170th try to bypass the State Farm at high speed, but to no avail. As soon as they get into close range, they take heavy losses from the dug-in anti-tank guns and whatever tanks or tank destroyers might actually be here. Some people think the Tigers are here already, but others disagree. I will cover that debate later. Already in the first 45 minutes or so, the attack has begun to lose momentum, and by noon, the 170th will have lost around 30 of its 60 vehicles, and its brigade commander has burned to death in his tank. Meanwhile, the 181st undertakes a very ambitious, perhaps even a foolhardy mission. They are tasked with hugging the river Psel and fighting their way through the villages that line the south bank, like Mikhailovka, Andreyevka, and Vasilevka. Over here, both brigades are vulnerable not just to the fire from the Leibstandarte, but also from Totenkopf's forces, who will soon be advancing along the other side of the Psel. The attack was essentially through a shallow valley flanked by enemy forces. It was a scenario reminiscent of the famous British charge of the Light Brigade from the Crimean War, and with similar results. While some of the 181st Brigade's tanks and infantry will be held up at the Oktyabrski State Farm meat grinder, others will push round the side and start fighting their way through that line of villages. Totenkopf's spotters looking across the river report that about 40 tanks enter Mikhailovka around 9 a.m. It's slow progress with a lot of house-to-house fighting. As for the Totenkopf division itself, well, they've managed to get their entire panzer group across the bridgehead at Keluchi. That is 133 tanks, including 11 Tigers. They're facing off against the 95th Guards Rifle Division, which fronts a sector stretching from Vasilyi to Hill 226.6. The hill itself is held by the 52nd Guards Rifle Division and the 284th Guards Rifle Regiment. The 11th Motorized Rifle Brigade also has 2 battalions on Hill 226.6. Northwest of here, 5th Guards Army Commander Zhadov has his headquarters on Hill 236.7. Already, there's been some early morning fighting, with SS fending off probing attacks by the 52nd and 95th Divisions. But these are impaired by a lack of coordination between the two Soviet units and a lack of tanks. After making some reconnaissance and probing attacks of their own, Totenkopf assembles its forces for the drive on Hill 226.6. We will see what happens with that attack later on. For that is where I will leave it for now, at about 10 a.m. Kirichenko's tanks have driven through Joachim Peiper's Panzer Grenadiers and Rudolf von Ribbentrop's tanks on Hill 252.2. Ribbentrop is now stuck on the hill, surrounded by the enemy and quickly running out of ammo. How will he escape? And there is now a far larger force of Soviet tanks and a whole load of infantrymen storming down the slope towards 2 companies of panzers. If these tanks break through, it could mean the collapse of the German front. And what about those tanks at Komsomolets State Farm? Will they be free to cause havoc in the German rear? And will the Soviets be able to crack the nut that is Oktyabrski State Farm? Find out next week. And join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com to get more great stuff like this, for it is the Army that makes our productions possible. Jeffrey 7 is the Time Ghost Army Prokhorovka pal this week, and these are the newest commissioned Army officers. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.